Is this thing on? Is it on? My pops used to tell me all the time, just read one page a night, feed on it, and don't try and understand it. And I would push against this so much. I would say, Pop, what are you talking about? He said, boy, just feed on the word. He said, when you were a kid, when you were a little baby, did you ever like what you were eating? And I said, well, I didn't know what I was eating. And he said, exactly. He said, you just needed to feed because you were hungry. It's not because you had a taste for it. So just feed on the word, just one page a day. And I resisted it. And then I started doing it. But the challenge was, and this is the challenge that I ran into last night with Proverbs 17, was I was looking at it and I was saying, man, these Proverbs are very conditional. This is like, do this, get that, do this, get that. Well, that doesn't always work. You know, I said, I had a question the other day about, wisdom will add days to your life. And then I asked the question, well, it didn't add days to my dad's life, to my pop's life. Like, this was crazy. And then we were in my men's group yesterday, and one of my friends, Ryan, was saying, a lot of these things sound conditional, and not everything turns out exactly the way that you want it. And that's what we're going to dive into today in Proverbs 17. We're going to talk about peace, prudence, discernment, pride, love, cheer, and that peace and all the things that can come in and steal that peace. So I'm excited to be able to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. We're diving deep into Proverbs 17 on Unscripted. Let's get this party started.
Cause we believin', it's for certain. We put the work in. We ain't stopped just because it's hurting. Right before your eyes, so it's coming to no surprise. The takeover is televised. Over and over and over again. Make no mistake, we continue to win. Defeat never known, cause I will not lose. They wanna mimic my moves, but can't walk in my shoes.
Welcome to another episode of Unscripted on the Kelly Cardenas podcast. I am your host, and guess what my name is? Kelly Cardenas. I want to thank you so much. I got a chance to be able to spend time with my really good friend, Mr. James Dixon, one of the top motivational speakers in the whole entire world. And last night we were talking about it, and it was amazing because he was talking about God's word, and he was saying God's word needs to have action to it. Meaning that you look at the circumstances in your life and then you apply what that principle was. And that's what Proverbs is to me. That's what Proverbs, through my study of it for the last 30 years, has been. And so I read the corresponding proverb, corresponding day. And why is that? Because it's 3,000-year-old wisdom that is still applicable in your leadership, your systems, and your culture today. But I find that it's not about just saying, oh, well, I just read this thing and then everything's going to be okay. No, I read it, I understand it, and then I apply it. That's what we have to do as human beings, because we're going to have different circumstances that come in, but principles never time out. So the principle base, like, what is the principle thing that's happening? And this was the challenge that I had with my pops a lot growing up, because he would always look at the principles as opposed to the circumstance. So he wouldn't look at, hey, that person cut you off on the freeway. He would look at the principle of it. Son, were you paying attention while you were driving? Were you driving a little too fast? Were you, tailgating that person? And then there's some of the circumstances that just happen that you didn't do anything to cause it. But because you have incredible principles, you know how to be able to react in that situation. And that's what Proverbs is. And again, we're going to dive into this: peace, prudence, discernment, pride, love, and cheer. Point number one is peace passes all understanding. And this is probably one of the biggest ones that I've struggled with at times, because when I go through challenges, whether it be personally, professionally, spiritually, or financially, and when we all go through them, when that circumstance hits and the next shoe drops, as they say, you're having a challenge financially, and then bam, you have a fight with your spouse, and then bam, your kids have something happen, and then on top of that, another financial stress happens. In this principle, peace passes all understanding. I was challenged with it, but in verse 1, it says, better a dry crust with peace and quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. In verse 2, it says, a prudent servant will rule over a disgraceful son and will share in the inheritance as one family. Let's take down the first one. Better a dry crust with peace and quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. How many of us have ever experienced this? How many of us have ever experienced, oh, wow, when I had the least, I was the most peaceful. When I was doing this small little thing and I was just focused in on what God had me to do on that day, I was peaceful. And then we took on hubris, meaning that just because I succeeded the last time, I think that I could succeed in anything as I move forward. And then I take on and I take on and I take on. This is the thing that my wife constantly would caution me, especially in the entrepreneurial journey, because for me, I always wanted more. Right when I was done with one or right about ready to kind of cross that mountain, I was just looking for the next mountain. But I didn't realize that I needed to go into the valley, and that valley would be dark. The dark would cause me to rest, and that rest would get me ready to climb the next mountain. In verse 2, it says, a prudent servant will rule over a disgraceful son. I think a lot of times people think that it's their birthright, or, they're in this scenario, so they deserve to have this. And it's amazing because when it says a prudent servant, so a person who serves everyone around them, sometimes doesn't have to have the accolades, doesn't have to have the prerequisites. But what God could do in that situation is when you're serving other people and you're pouring into other people, it can be incredible. And I've experienced this throughout my entire life. I want you to think about a time where you weren't qualified for a situation, but you were kind, you were serving, and you were able to get the nod. I find that this happens so often in life. So in that verse number 1, peace passes all understanding. Choose peace as opposed to more. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have more and peace, but we've got to choose peace first. And so as we go through this whole entire proverb with Proverbs 17, what I looked at is the whole emphasis was peace. And I was thinking, oh, wow, I'm just going to be so peaceful. No, and then it took me through the actionable items of peace and how peace is going to be able to happen in your life. And that brings us to point number 2. Intense heat will expose your character. Intense heat will expose your character. I had intense heat on Christmas Day. We were in Park City and we were going to go snowboarding, and our passes weren't working and they weren't logged online. And then I had to call one of those dreaded call centers where it's so loud. The person has such a strong accent that I can't understand anything that they're saying. And I'm getting more and more and more and more frustrated. And guess what happened? All that heat exposed what was going on in my life at the time. I was kind of stressed. I had a few things going on. And what happened was it was the tipping point for me. And my wife was like, it really wasn't that lady on the phone, was it? And I just wanted to tell her, yes, it was. Woman, you need to listen to me. And it wasn't. I was dealing with other things, and that intense heat brought the impurities to the surface. And in verse 3, it says, the crucible for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. The crucible for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. The crucible for silver means that it heats up. And with silver, when you take a silver ore, you heat it up into a molten state. The dross comes to the top, which are all the impurities. They scrape it off, and it becomes sterling silver. But the only way to be able to get to a purification standpoint is through intense heat. And when we go through intense heat in our life, this is where we have the opportunity to get excited because our impurities are coming to the top. But I can tell you, it's not that exciting while it's happening. And that intense heat, though, will draw out our character. And some people say I acted out of character. No, we expose. Like me on the phone with the telemarketer or whatever it is, that exposes what's actually going on. And I have to sit in that and deal with those things. Point number 3 is throwing your pearls to the swine. This was an eloquent lips are unsuited to a godless fool. How much worse lying lips to a ruler? Think of the contrast in that, right? And so eloquent lips are unsuited to a godless fool. So a person who's foolish, and a lot of times when I'm looking at this, I thought, it was talking about, look at it, these fools or those fools or whatever it was. And God was saying, no, sometimes you are a fool. Sometimes you're not working in wisdom. Sometimes you're not, and a lot of times you're not grabbing a hold of the principles that I've given you, and you're acting foolish in this time. And when you're acting foolish in this time, eloquent lips or wisdom doesn't go in that place. So make it congruent as much as possible. And when we make it congruent and we just stop and look and we say, am I in line with what I truly believe? And this goes in culture and leadership and systems. And ask yourself in your organization, ask yourself, am I in line? Is my actions, is my words, and is my heart in line with what I believe? Well, once that happens, things start to work out incredible. Point number 4 is listen. So listen is in verse number 12. That's point 4. Better to meet a bear robbed of her cubs than a fool bent on his folly. I think it speaks for itself. Just listen and listen for the little things that are happening, and you'll be able to tell. And honestly, it is better to meet a bear robbed of her cubs. You can imagine how vicious that is, than a fool bent on his folly. So listen and then choose your association wisely. Point number 6 is your point of view or perspective. And this comes from verse number 24. In verse 24, it says, the discerning person keeps wisdom in view, but a fool's eyes wander to the ends of the earth. Think of your point of view or your perspective. Your perception is based off of your perspective. So your perception is how you receive it. Your perspective is how you see it. So if you want to see it different or you want to receive it different, all you have to do is see it different. You could see this exact same remote this way and this way. It's the exact same remote, but you see 2 different sides. It's just perspective. And so when we look at that in verse 24, a discerning person, meaning that you take in the information and you process it and you slow down. A discerning person keeps wisdom in view, but a fool's eyes wander to the ends of the earth. If you keep wisdom in view, which is the fear of the Lord, things have the tendency to work themselves out. Not always in your favor, but they'll be in your favor on down the line in God's will, God's plan, and God's timing. Point number 7, as we finish up today, is unlike some of these episodes, because I'm going through so many different points and I'm doing it in a small, timely manner, we got to be slow to speak. And slow to speak is in verse 27 and 28. The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even-tempered. Even fools are thought to be wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues. This is probably the greatest example of this is my friend James Dixon. My friend James Dixon will say 5 words where most people will say 20. My friend James Dixon has power in every single word that he says. And it doesn't mean that he's serious all the time. He is one of the funniest individuals that I could ever imagine. But when he goes in to speak, he takes and distills down the amount of words that he says, and he listens more than he speaks. So be slow to speak. As we finish today, guys, peace is something we must actively construct through God's wisdom. So this is not I do this, I get this. That's not how Proverbs works. It's not how God works, but the way he works is that he wants to stay in tight communication with us. He wants us to be present, and he wants us to understand that it's not just going to be peace, I just sit back. It's going to be peace through the things that we're able to focus on and sometimes be aware of, right? And so when we're looking at it, intense heat will expose your character. Don't throw your pearls to the swine. You got to listen. We got to think about our point of view, protect our heart, which I didn't even talk about. Protect our heart and be slow to speak. And so what I didn't hit on was point number 5, which is protect your heart. And this is just verse 22 as we finish up. A cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. Peace, prudence, discernment, pride, love, and cheer. In Proverbs 17, when you read it, it's going to read different to you because your circumstances are different. I'll finish with this. My wife told me one time, I was so frustrated because I thought people didn't hear what I said. And she said, they won't hear what you say. They won't see what you do. They'll only hear where they are at. And what I want you to do is realize that in Proverbs, when you start reading it, it'll start reading you. And when you have different circumstances, it'll read different. That's why the corresponding proverb for the corresponding day will work every single time. Hopefully you had a phenomenal time with me on Unscripted. Proverbs 17. I have had an incredible time. Thank you so much for tuning in. I love you so much, and please subscribe, click the links, do all the notifications, and I am officially off the hot seat. Peace, love, and soul.